I'm Eric the Tech, and today I'm going to show you how to do a complete takeoff using the CAD version of the POD Takeoff and Estimating tool. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare our Excel spreadsheet so we can fill in some data. So we're going to fill out the name of our spreadsheet. In this case, since we're using the architectural drawings from the Poly residence, we're going to name this Poly CAD 1. And we're going to press Start Excel. And here's the spreadsheet. We're just going to make it a little bigger so we can see all of it. And we're going to be starting with 2x6 studs at 11 feet because that's what the plans dictate. And we're going to start with the longer studs. And they're 2x6. And before we start dimensioning our CAD drawing, we're going to open up the dimension styles prompt by typing in D and pressing enter. So we're going to look at PVEC details, and we have to make sure that we're using decimal units with a precision of 2 zeros. And now we're going to create a new layer where we could take some measurements. And since we're starting with studs, we're going to name this POD Studs. And we're going to make this a more visible color, like yellow. Now we're going to pick it. And now we can start measuring all the 2x6 walls. And we're going to measure how you normally would on AutoCAD by just pressing Dimension and clicking on opposite corners of the wall. So we can see a little better, we're gonna hide some of these layers. And we're going to keep on dimensioning. Now that we're done measuring all of our 2x6 studs, we're going to collect all of our values. And to do that, on each measurement, we're going to double click right where the number is. And then on our keyboard, press Ctrl A and Ctrl C. And then go over to the tool and press spacebar. And before you press space, just make sure that the tool is on stud mode. And here we go, we're clicking the measurement right on the number. We're pressing Ctrl A and then Ctrl C and moving over and pressing spacebar to copy the value into our tool. And we're going to do that for each one of our measurements. So double click, Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and spacebar. And as soon as we have all of our values together, we're going to press the calculate button to calculate how many studs we're going to count. And then we're going to press update cell to update that number into the cell that we picked on our spreadsheet. After we're finished with these cells, we're going to move on to our 2x10 studs. And again, we're going to double click the number, press Ctrl A and then Ctrl C, move over to the tool and press spacebar. And once we collect those values, we're going to press calculate and then update cell to update the cell corresponding to the 2x10 studs. Now that we're done measuring out all of our studs, we're going to measure our headers and beams. And to prepare our layers, we're going to go to layer properties again and add a new layer. We're going to call this one POD Headers and Beams. And we're going to make this one a different color, like white, or any other color that's clearly visible. And we're going to start off by measuring the 4x8 beams, or in this case 4x10 beams. And we're just going to measure the same way you normally would on AutoCAD by using the dimension tool. And now we're gonna look for the cell in our spreadsheet corresponding to the 4x10 headers and beams, so that we can fill in the value. And once again, to get these values, we're going to double click the dimension right where the number is, and then we're typing Control A and Control C and moving over to our tool and pressing space. We're going to do that for each instance of these 4x10 beams. And now that we have all of the values, we're going to press the calculate button. And press update cell so that we can get the value in the chosen cell. And now we're going to measure out with the 4x10 beams. We're going to measure out the 4x12 beams, again using the dimension tool. You just have to find all of the 4x12 headers and beams. And it's right here. We've got a floor beam. Now we're going to collect our values for the 4x12 beams. We're going to press Control A, Control C, and then move over to the tool and press space for each one of our 4x12 beams. Now that we have all these values, we're going to press calculate, look for the cell corresponding to 4x12 beams, and press update cell. Next, we're going to do our 4x8 headers and beams, and there's quite a few of these. We just have to find all of them. Now that we have all of our 4x8 beams, we're going to double click our dimension numbers, press Ctrl A, Ctrl C, then move over to our tool and press spacebar. And there's quite a few of them, so this will take a little bit of time. Now that we have all of our values, we're going to press the calculate and then update cell to fill in the cell corresponding to the 4x8 headers and beams. Now that we're done with those 4x8 headers and beams, we're going to measure out some 4x14 headers. And it looks like we have just one of those. So we're going to copy that value. By double clicking on the measurement, pressing Control A and Control C, and copying it with the spacebar. And once we have that value, we're going to press Calculate and then Update Cell. Now that we're done with the 4x14 headers and beams, we're going to move on to what look like 5 1/4 by 11 1/4 beams. And since on our spreadsheet we only have 5 1/4 by 11 7/8 headers and beams, we can switch the 11 7/8 to 11 1/4. And we're going to pick that corresponding cell. We're going to copy those values into our tool. And we're going to press Calculate. And then once we have the value, Update Cell. Now that we're done with all of our headers and beams, we're going to use area mode to find out how much flooring material we need. And since this is a new type of measurement, we're going to create another layer called POD area. And we're going to do that by going to our layer properties. And once we're in our layer properties, we're going to add the new layer, type in the name POD area, and change its color to something visible. And we're going to make it our current layer. And now we can start dimensioning out some rectangular areas using their height and their width. Since these are pretty easy shapes, it shouldn't take too long to measure out the widths and the heights of our rectangular areas. The measuring of our rectangular areas in terms of length and width is pretty easy, but the hard part is filling in these values in our tool. Now we're gonna double click on the width measurement of our rectangle and press Ctrl A and Ctrl C, and then press spacebar in our tool, and then we're going to copy in the other dimension using the same method, and we're just going to alternate on the length and the width for each of our rectangles, and we're going to add in these value pairs. And we're still using the same value collection method that we've used before, that just involves double clicking on the number of the dimension, pressing Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and then moving to our tool and pressing spacebar. And after we've collected all these values, there should be an even number of rows in our tool. And now that we have all those values, we're going to press calculate and then look for the correct flooring cell And per these plans, we're going to use 3/4 OSB for our flooring. And we're going to pick our corresponding cell. And in this case, it's a plywood cell, so it's one of the red cells. And we're going to press Update Cell. And there's all the flooring material that we'll need for this floor. Now that we're done with the area, we're going to measure out our joists for this particular floor. And once again, we have to make a new layer so that we can easily see our measurements. And so we can focus on the joist, we're going to remove a large amount of our layers so that we can just see this light blue joist layer. And we're going to name our new layer POD Joists. And we're going to make it a color that's easy to distinguish. And now that we have our layer set up, we're going to start dimensioning. And just before we actually start measuring, we're going to look for the correct joist cell in our spreadsheet. And in this case, it looks like they're all 2x12 studs. And they can be any length between 8 and 24. And for each set of joists, we're going to end up dimensioning the length of the joists and the span of how far the joist will cover. And just to be on the safe side, for the span, we're going to use a linear dimension that's always orthogonal, so we can get a straight line distance. Now we're gonna add each section of joist to our tool individually. We're gonna collect the length and the span of each joist area, and we're gonna collect those values like we normally do by double clicking on the number of the dimension, pressing Ctrl A and then Ctrl C, and then moving to our tool and pressing spacebar. And the length value is going to go on the first row, and the span value is going to go on the second row. And once we have those two values, we're going to press calculate, and the tool is going to tell us how long the studs are and how many of them there are. I'm going to do the next set of joists and press calculate again, and we keep on adding more joists, and the tool will keep track of how long the joists are. And we're going to do this a few more times until we have all of our joists that are 2x12. And we just have to remember that we're doing each region individually, because the program will act up if we try to put all of the joists into the same box. And here goes our last set of joists. I'm going to press calculate, and now we should have all of our joists. And we're going to press update cell, and since we were on the 2x12 8-foot long joist, there's not going to be much. But if we change our cell to the joists that are 10 feet long or 12 feet long, we're going to start to see our values coming in. We're going to press update cell for each one of these cells individually. And if we add up these joists that are now in the spreadsheet, they should add up to the value that's in our tool. In this case, that's 87 joists. Now that we're done with the joists, we're going to measure out our rafters. And it looks like there's a few of those on this floor. And so we're going to name this new layer POD Rafters and make it an easily visible color. And remember, we're doing this by pressing on layer properties at the top of AutoCAD. And we're going to set this new layer to our current layer. And we're going to measure out the length and the span of each rafter region. And we're going to set the tool to rafter mode. We're going to dimension like we normally do using the dimension tool. And we're using an orthogonal linear dimension for the diagonal lines corresponding to the span. And now we're going to collect our values by double clicking on the measurement, pressing Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and then spacebar once we're in the tool. And we're going to do each region separately by putting the length measurement in the first row and the span measurement in the second row. We're going to calculate again. By pressing calculate. And then we're going to look for the 2x6 rafter cell corresponding to each length. And it looks like the rafters aren't too long. And we're going to update the corresponding cells in the spreadsheet. We're done with the first floor, and before we move on to the second floor, we're going to delete some of the rows that you didn't use for the first floor. Now, to do this, we're just going to drag down on these numbers that are on the side of the Excel spreadsheet and just drag down to the empty unused cells. And now you're going to right click and press delete. And we're going to do that on every set of empty cells. And just to be more careful, we're going to start a selection each time. And don't worry about these ref warnings. They'll go away as you continue deleting the rows. And now we can print out this spreadsheet as just one page, as you can see in this print menu. Okay. Now we're going to save it, and we're going to move on to the second floor. And now we're going to use another spreadsheet so we can do a takeoff of the second floor. We'll call this POD CAD 2. Now we have to go to the second floor of our DWG plan. Now we're just checking how thick these walls are. Okay, so now we have an idea of how thick our walls are, and we'll know which nominal dimension to use. On the second floor, the distance between the floor and the top plate is about 10 feet, so we're going to have to deal with 10-foot studs. And most of these look like 2x6 studs, so that's what we're going to start with. And of course we're starting with the longer studs. Like we did on the first floor, we're going to start with our stud mode. Count up all the studs. And these look like all of the 2x6 studs. Oh, there's actually one more section of the longer 2x6 studs based off the shear schedule, and that's right here. And that's it. Now we just need to add them up. Remember, and remember, we have to double click each segment, press Control A, Control C, and then go over to the tool and press space. And we're just going to do that for every one of our sections. Now we're going to measure out our 2x8 studs, the longer ones. That looks like all of our 2x8 walls. Now we're going to do our 2x10 studs. And there's only a few of those, so this should be quick. Now we're going to measure out our 2x4 studs. That looks like all the 2x4 studs. And we're going to update the cell. Now we're going to look for our shorter studs, starting with the 2x6s. Now that we're done with the studs, we can move on to the headers once more. For the headers, we're going to use total mode, and we're going to start by measuring the 4x8 headers and beams. And that's it for the 4x8 headers and beams. We're going to press update cell. Now we can start measuring the 4x10 headers and beams. It looks like there's only one, so this should be pretty easy. And here's our 4x10 header. Now we're going to look at our 6x8 headers and beams. And lastly, we're going to look at our 6x10 headers and beams. And there's only 2 of them, so this should be pretty easy. Once we have our 6x10 beams measured out, we can copy their values to our tool by clicking the number on the dimension, pressing Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and pressing spacebar once we get in the tool. And when we have those values, we're going to press Calculate and then Update Cell. And just make sure to pick the correct cell. And that looks like it's it for our 6x10 beams for this particular floor. Now that we're done with our headers and beams for this particular floor, we can calculate the flooring area so that we can find how much flooring material we need. And from earlier, we still have our pod area layer, and we can start dimensioning. And we're going to dimension big squares like we did last time. And remember, we're measuring just the height and the width. Now we have to remember that we're using area mode. So on the tool, we're going to press area, and we're going to collect our values. And since we're doing the area, we're doing this in pairs of length and width. And once we collect all of these pairs of length and width, we can find what our area is. We just have to make sure that we're adding these values in pairs and not separately. Now we can press calculate, and we're going to update the correct cell, which we have to find. And here it is, the 3 1/4 OSB board. And it looks like we picked the wrong cell. We picked a lumber cell when we should be picking a plywood cell. And remember, the plywood is the red cells. Now here we go. Now that we're done with our flooring area, we can move on to the joists for this second floor of this residence. And since we're looking at the joist, we're going to turn off all the layers except for the layers pertaining to the joists. If you have any experience with AutoCAD, you'll know to be careful with this part so that you don't end up turning off the wrong layer. I'm just getting rid of a few more layers to get a full picture. Now we can switch over to the POD joist layer, and we're gonna dimension out both the length and the span of our joists. And before we do that, let's just make sure we use the right cell in our spreadsheet, which in this case is the cell for the 2x10 ceiling joists. And they run in lengths from 8 to 24. And now we're going to start dimensioning the length and the span of each joist region. When it comes to the joists, we're going to use an orthogonal linear dimension for the span. before we copy over our values, we have to denote in the tool that these are vertically oriented ceiling joists. And we do that by pressing the vertical button on our tool. And now we can copy our values over. And remember, we do this individually for each set of joists. And in the first column, we're entering the span, while in the second column, we're entering the length. And we're pressing calculate to count up all the joists. And we're just going to keep on doing this for each set of joists that we have. And the number will keep on increasing. And during this calculation, you'll notice how the program will tell you how long the joists are and how far they run. And that should be all of the joists. So now we're going to start updating these cells. Since the tool keeps up with how long the joists are and how many of them there are, it's only going to fill up the cells corresponding to the correct lengths. And if we look closely, we'll notice that the total values for these 2x10 joists add up to the total in our program. And right now, I'm just making sure of that. And it looks like our values are correct. Now that we're done with our joists, we can go on to measure out our rafters. And we'll know what rafters we're using when we look at the roofing plan. And it looks like we have our roofing plan right here. And we have to choose the vertical option on the rafter orientation. And now we're just going to dimension out our rafters. And we just need the length measurement and the span measurement for each region of rafters. And given that this is a weirdly shaped roof, there's going to be a whole bunch of crowded rafters. this part of the roofing plan is especially crowded, so you just have to be careful that you're measuring the right stuff. Measuring the length of our rafters is easy. And now for the span measurement, we just have to be careful to use a linear dimension that's orthogonal. It looks like we have almost all the rafters measured out. We just need a few more. And that looks like all the rafters. So now we're going to collect the values. And again, we're double clicking on the number for the dimension, pressing Control A, Control C, and then pressing spacebar once we're in the tool. And since we're in the vertical rafter orientation, we're going to put the span measurement on the first row of the tool and the length measurement on the second row. And once we have those two values, we'll press calculate to get the number of joists, and the total will just keep on adding as we go on. The one limitation to our joists and rafter modes is that each set of joists has to be added separately to our tool. However, the results are always accurate. And just so we know which set of joists we have added, I decided to erase the value after we copy it into the program. As you're adding new joists, keep in mind that the program will tell you just how long the joists are, so you know what cells to pick in the spreadsheet. It looks like that's it for our vertically oriented rafters, but it looks like there's a few sets of rafters that are oriented horizontally. So to deal with those, we have to go into the program and press the button that says horizontal. And now we're just gonna collect those values. And this time, and for the horizontal rafters, the length goes in the first row and the span goes in the second row. Now, the thing that separates the rafters from the joist is that when you measure the rafters, the program automatically adds 4 feet to their total length. Luckily for us, the updating works very much the same as it does for the joist. We're just going to pick every cell that corresponds to the 2x12 rafters of any length. And if you notice that you don't have a cell for 22 or 24 foot long rafters, then you could simply change the value in the length column on the Excel spreadsheet. And it looks like we have all the joists, all the rafters, because they add up to the total value in the program. And that looks like all of the rafters for this floor. And before we can say we're finished, we have to fill in the cells for the headers and beams on this particular floor. And so we can focus on the headers and beams. We're going to get rid of all the layers except for the header layer and the light blue layer for the joists. And for this floor, we're going to need to fill in the 4x12 headers and beams. And we're going to go over to total mode in our program. And we're going to start dimensioning in AutoCAD. And when we're measuring these diagonal headers and beams, we're going to take an aligned dimension. To take an aligned dimension, we're going to click where we normally would for a linear dimension, but we're going to hit that little drop down so that we can get the aligned measurement. And if you want to keep on adding align dimensions, you're just going to right click and press dim aligned, or repeat dim aligned. And that looks like all of the 4x12 headers and beams. So now we're just going to copy our values again. And remember, we're getting these values by double clicking the number on the dimension, typing Control A and then Control C, and then pressing the space bar when we get into our tool. And now we're going to press calculate, and we're going to update the cell. And now it looks like there's a few 7 by 11.25 inch PSL beams. And there's no 7 by 11.25, but there is 7 by 11 7/8. So we're going to change that 11 7/8 to 11.25. And now we're going to measure the 7 by 11.25 headers and beams. Now that we have all these beams, we're going to collect these values and copy them into our tool. And now we're going to calculate and update the cell. And that looks like everything for this floor. So now we're just going to delete the rows that we don't need by selecting the empty rows. Now we're going to select those empty rows by dragging down on the numbers that are off to the left side of the spreadsheet, and just dragging down and then right clicking and pressing delete. And we're just going to keep on deleting the unused rows until we get a manageable spreadsheet that you could easily print. And just make sure to make a new selection each time you want to delete a set of rows, so that you don't accidentally delete the rows that you need. and now you only have the rows that you're going to use. And if you want your numbers to line up, your item numbers to line up, you can just number a few of them 1 to 3 and then pick those cells and drag down from the corner, and Excel will automatically renumber the list for you. And now you're ready to print your list and be done with your takeoff.